Welcome back. My name is Sweet Chris, and in this video, we're going to be taking a look at certifications in NetSuite. Now, up until this point, I have done a few videos as well as prep courses on specific NetSuite certifications, but never on the entire certification structure. And I do get quite a few questions about which certifications apply to others or are there prerequisites, etc. So hopefully in this video, I can clarify the entire structure, both in terms of what these exams are, and in the later half of the video, I'll talk a little bit about, in my opinion, the usefulness and the value of the various certifications. So let's dive into this. Overall, there are 8 certifications that you can get in NetSuite. And in this kind of table, I'm going to try to categorize them because really they fall into 3 major groups. So first off, we have what I would consider the functional path. And when I say functional, I don't mean like the function of something, but when you talk about a NetSuite consultant, there's really 2 routes. There's the functional consultant and there's the technical consultant, or someone who's both. And what really that means is, can the person develop or do programming with SuiteScript or not? So if they do not have developer knowledge, that's considered just a functional consultant. So the first path of certification, I would really consider the functional path. And that starts with the Suite Foundation exam. That's probably the most commonly known one. It's definitely the most commonly taken exam. So it starts off with Suite Foundation. Once you pass that exam, you're then able to take the administrator certification. So Suite Foundation is a prerequisite for administrators. And then once you pass administrators, you can take the top of the chain, which is the ERP consultant exam, and get your ERP consultant certification. Now, again, I have talked about some of these in other videos, but just to recap here, Suite Foundation is, of course, the first one. And in my opinion, it's actually a pretty dumb test in terms of how it's formulated. Instead of trying to dig into your practical knowledge of NetSuite, the test really, it's almost like it was created to be a trick test. It covers a very, very wide range of topics, and it has a lot of trick questions in it. So even though there might be subjects that you know quite well, and it might seem like the question is relatively easy, they'll have these trick questions that it's trying to kind of lead you in one direction, but then there's just a little word or something slight that actually flips it on its head, and then the answer is something completely different. So a lot of people actually have trouble with the Suite Foundation test, especially if they're relatively new to NetSuite or they don't have years of experience. That's the first test. I do have a prep course on that test, but overall, I wouldn't say that it's a difficult test. It's just tricky, and it requires you to have a very broad range of knowledge of NetSuite. So that's the first one. Once you pass it, you move on to the administrator certification. And actually, in my opinion, the administrator's test is actually a little bit easier, mainly because the scope of the test is much narrower, right? It's focusing on customizations, workflows, roles and permissions. And as a result, as long as you have some familiarity with these subjects, these just a few subjects you have to focus on, then the test is actually quite straightforward. They also include far fewer trick questions in there. It's more just straight up questions. You either know what the answer is or you don't. If you can manage to pass Suite Foundation and you have at least some understanding of the administrator functions, you're going to find that test is not that difficult. Moving on from administrator to the ERP consultant exam is a massive jump in difficulty. The ERP consultant exam is just a very difficult test. It has quite a wide range of things that you're expected to know, and the depth of knowledge on these subjects is very extensive. So I would never recommend even trying to take that test unless you have really years of experience as a NetSuite consultant. And even then, I know plenty of people with 4 or 5 years of consulting experience, but they don't necessarily have a wide range of consulting. Maybe there's certain things they focused on, and they flunked the ERP consultant test multiple times as a result. So definitely up in terms of difficulty. Now, I do have prep courses for Suite Foundation and the administrator's course, The ERP consultants course, just because there's so much to know, that's definitely a much harder test to make a course for. So I'm sure at some point I will come out with something on it, but for now, you really just have to have that breadth of experience and try to tackle it on your own. So that's the first path of certifications. And again, I would say those are the most commonly taken certifications. The next path that you can take is the technical side. So really focusing on the developer, the programming knowledge using SuiteScript. The tests and certification for this have actually changed in recent years. They've gone through some evolutions as SuiteScript has evolved from some of the early versions like 1.0 that it originally had. Now it's up to 2.1. So they've actually been changing the certifications recently. And I'm going to be speaking as in terms of the present in 2024, the way that this is structured is that what they used to have as one exam, they've now split it into two. So there's the app developer certification and there's the web services developer certification. Now, if you're already a SuiteScript developer, you probably already understand the difference between these, but for people like myself that are not trained on JavaScript and SuiteScript, the simplicity is really the app developer is more if you're customizing things in NetSuite, maybe creating automations, things like that. That's going to be your app developer certification. And if you're doing things that are less creative, but more connecting things like integrations, maybe a HubSpot integration, or you're connecting up some app into NetSuite so these things can talk to each other, then you're going to be looking at skill sets that really apply to the web services developer certification. Now, in terms of these tests, again, because I'm not a developer, I haven't done them personally, I can't necessarily comment on their difficulty. However, when I spoke to several developers who had gotten the certifications, the general consensus was these tests are certainly shorter. They're usually about half the length of things like Suite Foundation or the administrators or ERP consultant exams. And as long as you have some SuiteScript experience and you've actually worked with these things, you're going to find that these tests, especially now that they've been split apart because they're kind of different skill sets, they individually are not that difficult to take. So you can approach them, kind of study up for them. They have exam guides, they have sample tests. You can study up on these things and manage to pass these exams. Now, up from both of these, you have the Suite Cloud Developer, which again, that's a term that was used previously that used to just be one exam that you used to take and you would get your Suite Cloud Developer certification. Now, this one is unique to the degree that there is no exam. So to get your Suite Cloud Developer certification, what you need to do is you need to pass the exam for the app developer and pass the exam for the web services developer. And in addition to this, and I fully agree with this, you have to take and pass the Suite Foundation certification. The concept being that you're not just a great programmer, but you have a basic understanding of how NetSuite works. And if you really talk to any expert or very experienced developer, they'll all say the same thing. You can't just program in a vacuum. You really need to understand basic business practices and how NetSuite works to be a great SuiteScript developer within it. So that certification comes upon completion successfully of those three examinations. And that's really the culmination of the technical path. The third path, really not a path necessarily, but the third category is you could say additional or miscellaneous. There's basically two additional certifications. They're not prerequisites to anything. They don't fit in with anything else particularly. They're just standalone. The first of those is the financial user certification. And as the name implies, really the purpose of it is to take people that have accounting experience and to prove that they then have that experience with NetSuite so they can take their accounting skills and they can apply it in NetSuite. That test, I'm actually currently in the process of making that prep course, so I'll make an announcement for that probably in the next couple of weeks. But if you have accounting, like if you're an accountant, that test I do not find is that tricky. It's simply testing your basic knowledge of accounting practices and then a relatively easy surface level understanding of NetSuite, maybe a couple more complicated things that strictly and directly tie to accounting functions and activities. So that one, again, I wouldn't say is that difficult. It's also not a cakewalk, but it's not something that if you want to approach it and you have some accounting experience, you could easily do. Then we have the Suite Analytics certification, which ironically has nothing to do with Suite Analytics. The term Suite Analytics, for me, I primarily think of that as the tool in NetSuite that you can use for reporting. So you can make all kinds of cool charts and graphs, and you can use data sets, all these things. That's Suite Analytics. At least in the NetSuite world, they still consider that Suite Analytics is something that's new, even though it's been around for years. So they still haven't managed to actually incorporate anything regarding Suite Analytics in any of their different examinations. You won't see a single question on Suite Analytics anywhere. So this certification, even though it's called Suite Analytics, really what they're referring to is just the general concept of analytics and reporting in NetSuite. So that's custom reports, that's more advanced saved searches, that's various portlets that provide reporting and analytical information, web queries, things like that. So it's similar to Financial User. If you already have experience and you're familiar with these kind of reporting tools and how to utilize them, that is a relatively easy test. However, if you're not, or maybe if you just know saved searches, but you've never made a custom report, or you're not familiar with the KPI portlets so much, you might find that's a little bit of a trickier test because it is going to be testing you on all of these various reporting tools. Of course, not including Suite Analytics, ironically, but as long as you can have an understanding of all of those tools, that test is not necessarily that difficult. And that really sums up those 8 possible certifications. 7 tests, 8 possible certifications that you can achieve. So now that we've talked about what certifications are available and some of the basic concepts behind them, let's take a look, and again, subjectively, from my opinion, at the usefulness and the value of these various certifications. And we'll start from the beginning again. Suite Foundation, in my opinion, is such a pivotal stepping stone to go on to administrators, or even if you want to go to Suite Cloud Developer, you have to do Suite Foundation. So to that degree, again, it's by far the most commonly taken test, and you could say that it has a lot of value to that degree. However, I do want to comment on the fact that in itself, I don't actually think that certification is that valuable, just in terms of having it as a certificate. And what I mean by that is there's really 2 major circumstances, as far as I can think with, in terms of when you would want to have a certification. So if you're dealing with a company that doesn't know NetSuite that well, you might want a certification to prove to these people that you do know NetSuite and that they should trust that you can do NetSuite, whatever that function is, with their company. So that's kind of one reason you would want certification. A second major reason you would want it is because you're going to a company or to a person who does know NetSuite, and you're trying to kind of put up some credentials to prove to them that you also are kind of in the fold, you know how to use NetSuite, and they can just kind of assume that the things that they know, that you similarly are tracking with that. So for example, if you're trying to get hired as a NetSuite consultant, you're talking to a consulting agency, then having an ERP consultant certification is just kind of an automatic. It shows that you have quite a bit of experience and that you are minimally capable of getting an interview to have a potential job opportunity. So if you can think with these 2 different paths, and then you take a look at the Suite Foundation certification, you can see that it actually doesn't necessarily help you a lot on either path. Because if you, for example, you are a NetSuite administrator, you're trying to go to companies that use NetSuite and you want to get a job being the administrator for those companies. They're clients of NetSuite. If you have a certification that says Suite Foundation, that doesn't necessarily mean something to a company that makes postcards. They don't know much about NetSuite. That certification doesn't necessarily mean anything to them. So they might say, well, that's nice, but it doesn't go as far, in my opinion, as having an administrator certification. You're applying for the job of administrator. You have a certificate saying that you're trained on that job. That has quite a bit of credibility and it lends some weight to it. And then on the flip side, if you're trying to get a job from a consulting company, people that know NetSuite also know that Suite Foundation is really the lowest level of certification. It's not that impressive to consultants and people that have been working in NetSuite for years. So In my opinion, it doesn't necessarily add a lot of credibility to you on the consulting side, nor does it necessarily resonate with people that don't know anything about NetSuite. As opposed to, if you can get the administrator certification, it can definitely be great if you're trying to get that kind of job. And then conversely, if you're trying to get a job as a consultant, the ERP consultant exam is definitely very valuable. Again, it's very hard to get, but if you can get it, it certainly immediately communicates that you know, and you at least have quite a few years of experience doing NetSuite consulting. So that's on the functional side. Now, again, when we get into the technical side, I can't comment personally just because I am not a developer. But when I spoke to a number of developers, I noticed a couple things. First off, the frequency that developers had technical certificates was much less than the functional consultants and functional administrators having the functional certificates. In fact, I found more often than not, the developers more commonly had things like the Suite Foundation certificate as opposed to any kind of technical certificate. So that's definitely a trend that I've noticed, is that developers often don't even bother to get the certificates. And then in addition to that, it seems like, again, there's differing opinions. Some people felt like their certificates were definitely very valuable. Others felt, especially if they didn't get their certificates, they felt like it didn't have anything to do to help them in their career. And many developers agreed that when you're being a SuiteScript developer, getting a job and finding good work really relied on you being able to sit down in the interview and do some development or do some scripting in front of the interviewer and do it competently. Lastly, taking a look at financial user and Suite Analytics. Personally, I feel like getting the financial user certificate, if it kind of fits in with your career path, that's actually an excellent certificate to get, mainly because there's so many people with some sort of accounting experience that are looking for jobs or trying to get into companies that have NetSuite as a system in some accounting role. So maybe you want to be an accounts payable clerk, or even as a controller, or maybe even a CFO. If you have these accounting skill sets and you're trying to apply to a company, if you can prove with a certification that not only do you have the accounting knowledge needed for that role, but they also don't have to go through the work of training you up on how to use NetSuite and all of the various quirks of NetSuite. If you've got a certification saying that you already are completely familiar with that and you can simply jump in and start doing your job, that provides a lot of credibility. And that could, if you had an interviewer looking at two people, one of them has the financial user certification, the other one doesn't, and if their accounting levels were the same, I certainly would think the interviewer would be leaning in the direction of the person they don't need to groove in on NetSuite itself. So for the difficulty of that exam and kind of the length of it and how much would be required to study, I do think that's kind of easy pickings for someone that is in an accounting role. And lastly, the Suite Analytics, I kind of almost conversely to the financial user, I find it hard to believe there's a lot of instances where someone's hiring or specifically looking for someone that has analytics experience just as a particular function. So I'm sure there's consultants that get it as just kind of something to tack on to their resume. But in my experience, this is the least sought after and the least attained certification amongst everything, including the technical certifications. So that's it on your overview of NetSuite certifications. As I mentioned earlier, I already have prep courses for Suite Foundation and the Administrator certification, and I'm about to come out with one for the Financial Users course. So if you're interested in any of those, you can always check out the link below. And if you found this video helpful, please hit that like button, subscribe if you want to see more videos like this, and I'll see you in the next video.